A Midrash of the Torah has been written by the Apostle Paul, and it is hidden right under our noses in the New Testament. Watch as we learn about this discovery from the man who discovered it. David Pitcher, great to be with you today.
Thanks, Bob and Dennis.
And Dennis Northington, my good friend.
Yep.
We're here in Austin, Texas, and you have happened to be passing through town. And so we took this opportunity to nab you and say, you can't go back home until you stop and talk to us a little bit.
I've been very blessed to be here.
So the topic that Dennis and I have been grappling with, thinking about, working on is this topic that you discovered, this connection between the epistles of Paul and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. A very deep connection, a stronger connection, as you would say, a stronger connection than had ever been seen. Well, let me start with that question. This connection that you found between some of Paul's epistles and the Torah that you believe you found, is it new? Do you think you might be the first person to ever notice something like this?
Well, actually, a Jewish anesthesiologist, a colleague of mine, was the first. He said, Dave, you've discovered a Midrash. And I didn't even know what a Midrash was.
Well, wait. He's the first to name what you discovered.
Right.
But do you think that anybody else has anybody else ever seen this connection that you believe you found?
Well, obviously Paul did, because he wrote it and he laid it all out for us. But in the British Museum, there is a papyrus that suggests that someone in the 3rd century actually knew it existed.
Interesting.
But after that, all the trail has been lost.
So there is the discovery, and then there is the story behind the discovery. I'd like to begin by just asking you, okay, what essentially does it mean that there is a connection, or as you just said, a midrash between some of the epistles of Paul and the Torah?
Well, a midrash, in the Jewish sense, is just a commentary on the Torah. But the midrashim, the plural of midrash, those were written between 300 and 1400 AD. You're
talking about the official Jewish midrash,
right?
Midrashim. Okay.
And those were written by multiple authors. This midrash was completed in 67 AD because Paul died in 67. So we have lots of information about the writer of this midrash.
So what does it essentially mean for there to be a midrash, for a certain, give us an example of a book in the New Testament that is connected to the Torah, and what does that look like when you say it's a midrash?
So Galatians, Paul's letter of Galatians, freedom from the slavery of sin, is connected to Exodus, freedom from slavery. So the theme, just the overall theme of Galatians, is the theme of Exodus. But more than that, there are themes throughout Galatians that are drawn out of Exodus. And there's words that are actually connected to Exodus from Galatians that you can't tug Galatians from Exodus neither which way.
But you said there's words drawn out. Are you saying that in Galatians there is like a linear connection?
There are sections of Exodus and there are sections of Galatians, and within those sections of Exodus, Paul takes words and builds a commentary on what is happening in Exodus.
And is it random? When you read Galatians, are you jumping all around Exodus?
No, it's sequential. It goes right from Galatians 1 and Exodus 1 all the way to the end of Galatians and the end of Exodus.
So you're saying the first few verses of Galatians chapter 1 correspond or somehow are illuminating the first section, some corresponding section in Exodus?
You're leading the witness, but you're doing it very correctly.
Okay.
Yeah, that is correct.
But Exodus is much bigger than Galatians.
Right. That is not a problem because Paul condenses the commentary into just the chapters of Galatians.
So the high points.
The high points, right.
I'm going to annotate this interview from time to time to help make sure certain points are clear because we're moving pretty fast here. This diagram is exactly the way Galatians begins. The first 5 verses in Galatians are inspired by and are midrashing on the first 11 verses of Exodus. Then the next 4 verses are inspired by and are a midrash of the next 22 verses, and so on. Later on, we're going to give you a document that not only shows this structure, but will also list the shared words between this section and the other. In this next part of our conversation, I just decided on the fly to ask David about a very famous verse in the New Testament and what he thinks about it. I have no idea where this is going to lead. Let's rejoin and see what happens. So we've heard it said in the New Testament that all Scripture is inspired. And so, is it Paul that says that?
2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for doctrine, for reproof, and so on. That word, God breathed, is actually in Numbers, but it's actually turned around when Balaam's breath was God breathed or breathed by God. So he uses that word. That's an anchor point right there in 2 Timothy and Numbers.
Okay, so we got multiple things going on here. Let's unravel this. The first thing is Paul has a statement that all Scripture is inspired. We've taken this in Christendom to mean that the Old Testament is useful, it is valid, it is valid in its application. We'd say the Hebrew Scriptures instead of Old Testament. I like that better, but it's all valid.
Right.
Okay, so that's true at a general level. And the authors of the New Testament were Jewish. Okay, so we have a Jewish connection no matter what, right? But you're saying that there is even a more specific connection, and so are you saying 2 Timothy is connected to Deuteronomy?
No, to Numbers.
To Numbers.
To Numbers.
Okay.
But think about it this way: when Paul wrote all Scripture is inspired by God, we didn't have the New Testament.
Correct.
It wasn't put together.
Correct. That's why it had to be the
Right.
Old.
So it had to be the Hebrew Scripture. But he actually had the Septuagint at that time too. So he's saying the Septuagint and the Hebrew Scripture, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scripture and the Hebrew Scripture itself are inspired by God. So the contextual meaning of all Scripture is inspired by God is anything that is translated from the original language. So anything translated from Hebrew is inspired from God. Anything translated from the Greek Septuagint into like another language like English, he's not saying that. He's saying the Greek was translated from the Hebrew, so the Greek is inspired by God. The Hebrew is inspired by God. We know over 265 verses in the New Testament are verbatim from the Septuagint or changed mildly for a certain reason. So when we say inspired by God, there's this thought that, well, some Scripture is preserved by God and some Scripture is inspired by God. So this translation is preserved, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you have Swahili and your Swahili is translated from the original Greek in the New Testament and the original Hebrew in the Hebrew Scripture. That Swahili is inspired by God, not preserved by God, but inspired by God. Otherwise, what are you going to do when you go to the Swahili believer and say, oh, your scripture is it's not really inspired by God, it's preserved by God? No. The context of 2 Timothy 3:16 says that Paul had the Greek translation of the Hebrew, and he had the Hebrew. All scripture is inspired by God. That's what he had. That's the context of that verse.
And when you take that verse in 2 Timothy and direct it back to Numbers in the linear sequencing of commentary on Numbers, tell us again, where does it end up?
So Paul is using a very controversial figure in Israel's history, Balaam. And Balaam was inspired by God.
This is the guy that the donkey spoke to him.
Yes,
right?
and this is the guy that that Balak tried to get to prophesy against Israel.
Right.
And
against Israel. Right.
Against Israel. And this is the guy that Israel slew with the sword. But nevertheless, the guy's words were inspired by God, and they're recorded in Numbers. And so Paul kind of uses as an exclamation point that all scripture is inspired by God, even the words of Balaam that Moses recorded.
So you're saying that it was the perfect place.
It was the perfect person.
If Paul was going to describe the truth of what that all scripture inspired by God really meant, he couldn't have picked in Numbers a more appropriate place to make that comment.
You're exactly right.
And it falls, are you saying that if you lay out 2 Timothy like on a linear sheet and you lay out Numbers, that you're going to find this commentary essentially the right place?
That Numbers in 2 Timothy actually turns out to be the very first place that the light went on for me.
Okay, tell us. Tell us this story.
Well, all stories have a backstory. And I'll try not to be too long, but I don't know how you study scripture, but I study it. Dennis, I know you do portions of the Torah and portions of the New Testament, and and that's great. I actually study long sections of scripture for long periods of time. So I studied Psalms for 3 years, and then I was getting ready to put all my thoughts together, and God directed me to study Isaiah. So I studied Isaiah for 5 years. 5 years. I actually wrote a book about Isaiah. And at that point, I saw something very specific, and I asked God a question. And I'm telling you, Dennis and Bob, if I tell you the question, you're going to laugh like Sarah did. So I don't want to tell you the question, but God answered me, and He said, David, you know.
Wait. You had this question that was very, very big to you.
From the study of Isaiah.
Okay, from the study of Isaiah.
And it came right out of Isaiah.
Okay.
And God said, David, you know. And
what, like as the answer?
That was the answer.
Like in other words, you've asked me this question, but you know the answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, you know, David. So I did. So I said, I guess I do. So I thought, well, that was fun. And so I enrolled in a Bible college, and I was kind of half-hearted. And so I took a course in Isaiah to see if there was anything I'd missed. And there wasn't really, but I enjoyed it. So then I took another course in Romans, and I thought, that was fun. So then I did I went full head. And one of the first courses that I took I had a full, no, I'm still a physician and everything, and so I'm working, but I decided to do this at night. And one of the courses was on the pastoral epistles. And you know the pastoral epistles are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And I had to do a research topic. And it had to include a word study. And the word study, I had already done a word study on the word seal.
S-E-A-L.
S-E-A-L. And every time the word seal is used in the Hebrew scripture, there is a relationship. And it's always associated with the sign. So the seal and the sign, they go together. So I've done this long word study on the word seal, and we had to do a word study for this project. And there's only one use of the word seal in the pastoral epistles, and that's in 2 Timothy 2:19, which says, nevertheless, the foundation of the Lord is sure, sealed with this inscription, the Lord knows those that are his, and those that are his must turn away from wickedness. I wanted to center the project on the word seal, but you know how a section starts and finishes, and you just can't truncate it. So it turned out to be 19 verses, but the instructor said you got to have it done at the right time, even though it's longer. So I said no problem. So instead of 35 pages, it turned out to be 195 pages. And so I wrote a book about that as well. But that's how it started when the instructor said, "Who are these forefathers?" And I said, I couldn't believe it. And I looked, the word father, forefather, is there in 2 Timothy. That was where it came from, 2 Timothy 1:3.
Wait. Just about this. You mentioned the word forefathers, but you picked 19 verses within 2 Timothy that you wanted to write this massive, now it turned out to be a massive paper on, a book. The professor brought up the word forefathers. Where in the book of 2 Timothy was the word forefathers?
So I had seen in this project that Numbers 16:5 was quoted by Paul in 2 Timothy 2:19. Okay. He said, the Lord knows those that are his. He turned it around a little bit because in the Septuagint it's the word theos. God knows those that are his. Mm-hmm. Paul said, Kurios, the Lord knows those that are his. But everybody agrees that is a direct quote. So I already knew that there was a connection between 2 Timothy 2:19 and Numbers, because it was
16:5. Explicitly right there.
You can't tug 2 Timothy 2:19 from Numbers 16:5 one way or another. So when that forefathers came about, Numbers 1 through 4 all mentions the forefathers. There's a whole list of all the forefathers.
Wait. So the professor wasn't talking about your 19 verses, and he wasn't talking about the connection. He was just making a comment or asking a question to the class.
Exactly.
And the word forefathers in 2 Timothy is right at the beginning then?
It's the word forefathers is in 2 Timothy 1:3. And the forefathers.
Okay, so the third verse of the book has the word forefathers in it.
Right. And all of the forefathers are mentioned in the first part of Numbers.
Okay, let's stop here and explain what has happened. During his free time as a doctor, David embarks on a 5-year study of Isaiah in English and in Hebrew. One of the things he is attracted to is the word seal. After taking Bible classes on Isaiah and Romans, and then a class about the Greek language, he moves on to take a class about Paul's 3 pastoral epistles. As he goes into that class, he has obtained a Greek Bible published by Charles Vanderpool that has both the Greek New Testament and the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, included in it. So there he is in class with that book on his desk. Now, in that class, the instructor requires a word study for the class. David wants to do the word study on the word seal. And the word seal only appears in 2 Timothy 2:19. In that verse, right next to the word seal, is a quote from the book of Numbers. The Lord knows those that are his. By the way, this is the only place in 2 Timothy where the book of Numbers is directly quoted. David has his Greek Bible open to both 2 Timothy and Numbers because he's thinking about the project that he's going to have to do. While David is thinking about this connection between the two books, the instructor is in the front of the class talking about the first chapter of 2 Timothy. He's looking at verse 3, and he asks the class, who are these forefathers? At that point, an idea breaks forth in David's mind that the book of Numbers begins with a list of all the early forefathers of the nation of Israel. So he already has his Greek Apostolic Bible on the desk, and it was already open to 2 Timothy and Numbers because of that direct quote. So he goes back to 2 Timothy 1:3, and there he sees the word patros, which is a single word that means our fathers, that we tend to translate forefathers. And then holding his place there, he opens up Numbers to chapter 1, and he starts scanning down, and sure enough, the word patron is there, which is like saying according to their fathers, like their father's household. It's a patrilineage type of word. And he scans down and he starts to notice the repetition of all the fathers listed. And it is happening almost every verse, more than 14 times in the chapter. And seeing such an obvious pattern, he wonders, are there any more words shared between 2 Timothy and Numbers in the Greek? So as he keeps his finger moving down in each book, he looks in the Greek translation and he starts to pick up more shared words from 2 Timothy that are also in Numbers. And it keeps happening and happening. And it seems as though there is a sequence to it. It's not just random. So now, let's get back to the story and hear what happens next.
So here I am going through this, and I don't listen to anything else that's going on. And I'm going, I can't believe it. So a Messianic Jew is sitting right behind me, and he's going, David, what's up? And I said, Keith, you're not going to believe this, but all of the Greek words line up in Numbers in order. And look at this. And so he said, David, I know where Janus and Jambres are. And I go, well, they're not in the Hebrew scripture at all. And he said, well, you're right, but I know where they are. I said, so by this time, I had done a rough draft of all these Greek words in Numbers and all the Greek words in 2 Timothy. I said, don't tell me where Janus and Jambres are. If they're anywhere, they've got to line up with where Janus and Jambres are, 2 Timothy 3:8. Because remember, I just found 2 Timothy 2:19. So 2 Timothy 3:8, where Janus and Jambres are mentioned by Paul, is not too far away. So I said, they've got to be between Numbers 21 and Numbers 23. And he goes, how'd you know? I said, don't ask, just tell me where they are. He says, well, they're in Numbers 22:22. They are the two servants that are following Balaam behind them. And in Jewish tradition, those are Janus and Jambres. Now, you won't find that in Christian books or Christian commentaries. You won't find them in Christian commentaries. you'll find them in Jewish commentaries. So here we have extra biblical proof of what Paul was doing. So at that point, I was off to the races. So I found all the connections between 2 Timothy and Numbers, and I said, God, and God said, David, you're not done.
Oh.
And I said, I guess not. And so, because the ox, you shouldn't muzzle the ox, that's pretty clear. It's in 1 Timothy. So God gave us a huge clue and gave us an anchor point. That's what I call where the Hebrew scripture can't be tugged from the New Testament one way or another. It's an anchor point.
David is moving fast here, so let me jump in and annotate what he is saying. After God told him, Dave, you're not done, the first place he looked was in the other pastoral epistles that he had just been studying in his class. So he noticed in 1 Timothy that there is a direct quote of Deuteronomy in that book. Don't muzzle the ox while he is threshing. This is universally understood to be a direct quote from Deuteronomy. So with that as a second seed of an idea, he started looking for shared words between the book of 1 Timothy and the book of Deuteronomy. And guess what? There was once again the same connection as he had seen before. And in this case, he has ended up identifying almost 60 corresponding sections between these two books. Okay, let's get back to the story.
And so obviously the first of Timothy and first of Deuteronomy and the last of 1 Timothy and the last of Deuteronomy line up, and then it's just easy to find all the other Greek words. And so I said, God, that's great. And he said, you're not done. I said, I should have known. And so I looked for Titus. And Titus goes with Joshua.
So now he finds that the third pastoral epistle of Paul also has the same characteristic, but it fits with the book of Joshua. Titus is a very short book, and it only shares 24 sections with Joshua. So that Bible class he took on the three pastoral epistles turned out to be the basis for the first three discoveries. Okay, let's get back to the story.
And then I said, God, I got it all finished, but I'm not done, am I? So I preempted God. I said, I know I'm not done. He said, you're right. And so then I had to find the other Pauline epistles that go with Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. And that wasn't hard to do.
Wow. Wow.
How long ago was that?
Well, I started in Isaiah and Psalms back in the early 2000s. And then I found the framework, the connection of the words, which I did not know was a Jewish Midrash, but I found that in 2008.
Yeah, it's like the honor of kings, so it's not hidden as to be put away. It's to be found as a treasure.
It's a great treasure.
It is. So let's summarize some of the connections. Genesis is connected to
Hebrews.
Okay. Exodus is connected to
Galatians.
Leviticus is connected to
Romans.
Numbers.
2 Timothy.
And Deuteronomy.
1 Timothy.
And then the next book is Joshua.
Titus.
Are there any other connections that you found?
I have looked and looked and looked all through Paul's letters, and have not found the words. And there are a little less than 18,000 words in those 6 books of Paul's. And he has over 1,300 words used in sectional order. So I've divided it up into 246 sections which have ideas that are drawn out and commented on by Paul.
Okay, so this is interesting. Actually, I think it perhaps strengthens your case, because if you say, yes, these 6 books of Paul do connect linear section-wise to these books, bam, and it's over and over and over again, 1,300 words. And then you go to other books and you don't see it at all.
Maybe a couple here and there, a couple words. There's not the number of words that are connected.
There you have the discovery. David Pitcher, over a period of about 5 years, has found that these 6 books are connected. This connection only exists with these 6 of Paul's epistles. None of the other 8 letters he wrote contain this connection. In these 6 cases, to have 7% of the words of these letters in consecutive sectional order as a consistent pattern over these 6 books is amazing. 7% may not sound like a lot, but it is right in between the 2 examples we gave in the past. In addition, there are many shared concepts in addition to the shared words. But there is a learning curve. Don't expect to take out Hebrews and Genesis and read them side by side and have everything fall in place for you right away. More on that as we go along. What is the takeaway here? What is the point to ponder as we go forward? I think the takeaway is this. Our forefather Paul has written a Midrash on the Torah in his own quiet way. It has been hidden for hundreds, if not 2,000 years. The takeaway is that our forefather Paul, a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, is going to open his mouth to us as Christians and show us how he sees the Torah. We thought we had all of his writings available to us, but no, we are alive and present at a time when, thanks to the work of David Pitcher, incredibly, unbelievably, Paul, after 2,000 years, is about to once again open his mouth. Next time, we will come back and continue talking with David and Dennis about what this discovery could mean for the Christian faith, what it could mean for our forefather Paul and people's perceptions of him, and how people are reacting to and objecting to this discovery. In addition, David will be making some of his latest research available to Root Source newsletter subscribers. Make sure you are on the Root Source newsletter at rootsource.com. Until then, this is Bob Odell from Root Source saying Shalom.